All right, welcome in everyone. You were listening to Bulls Central, and I am joined with me today by a very special guest, a friend of the channel who's been kind enough to meet with us yet again. You know him from all of his great work in covering the Chicago Bulls and his amazing attention to detail with the stats and analytics. He's also known as the Young Goat, right? It's my pleasure to introduce to you Rob Schafer of NBC Sports Chicago. Rob, good to have you back on the show, man. Also, how'd you get that nickname started, by the way? I've always kind of been curious about that.
One, good to be back, Jamal. Always a pleasure. Two, I have no idea how the nickname started. That was Adam Amin. He took that and ran. It's, I always kind of, clench up a little bit when that's said. I'm not a big attention guy, but I do appreciate it. And all love to Amin and everybody with the broadcast. The linear folks at NBC are all great and very supportive. I don't know how that originated. I think it must have just come off the top of his head one day.
So it was Adam Amin. Okay, so we'll give him the props for that nickname. I love it. So for those watching, make sure you follow Rob on Twitter, Rob_Schafer. Make sure you check out his work on NBC Sports Chicago. He does excellent work in covering the Bulls, and also be sure to subscribe to the Bulls Talk podcast hosted by Rob and Casey Johnson. I don't want to get too sidetracked because we're here to talk about the Bulls. So Rob, last time I had you on, it was right before the start of preseason play. I think it was just a couple days before the Bulls' first preseason game. So it's been a while. And here we are, just a couple months left in the season. I think it's just a little over 20 games. The Bulls are sitting 39-24, currently third in the East after last night's loss. And I do want to talk about the Bulls and how they've been doing recently, more specifically tonight's upcoming game. But from last time we spoke to now, seeing where the Bulls are at, despite all the injuries, COVID protocols, the team has somehow been able to manage to still be at the top of the Eastern Conference. What's sort of been the biggest surprise to you so far this season from this Bulls team?
There are a couple. I think from the beginning of the season, the way the team coalesced so quickly from a chemistry perspective wasn't the most surprising thing in the world, because I always thought the idea that specifically with Zach and DeMar, that they weren't going to mesh. I always thought that was a little bit overblown because, and I think this has changed a little bit this year, but the impression of both of those guys from a national perspective, from a zoomed out perspective, is that they're these, isolation scorers that weren't, there wasn't going to be enough basketballs to go around. But Zach has been, progressing as a playmaker for years, super unselfish guy. I think you see that in the way that he's embraced DeMar and kind of taken him in, even though Zach, was and is kind of the face of the franchise. DeMar, obviously, it's been well documented how much he grew as a facilitator in San Antonio. But the way, just from top to bottom, I mean, the chemistry on this team, to me, is some of the best that I've seen in my, short time covering the NBA. Guys have a one-track mind. They celebrate each other's success. And, I didn't even mention Nikola Vucevic, who's probably been asked to sacrifice more than any of the star level guys on the team. I know he's had shooting struggles and he's kind of been in and out in terms of having his rhythm as a scorer, but as a facilitator being a boon on the glass, the Bulls have actually held up fairly well as a defensive rebounding team, even though that's been kind of an issue of late, giving up offensive boards. So that I think was the biggest surprise, was seeing how fast they hit the ground running. At the start of the season. Now, obviously, that's slowed down. We're talking right now, they're in the middle of a 3-game losing streak and are in danger of slipping a little bit in the standings. There have been injuries. So that's kind of dampened that a little bit. But the big picture of a team that only has 2 guys on it, with Patrick Williams hurt, really Zach and Coby White are the only people that are, constants from last season. Yeah. And for them to have gelled as quickly as they have and to be near the top of the conference, it was a pleasant surprise. But I can't say that I would have predicted that this group would be so tight-knit as it was at the start of the season.
Yeah. And I'm sure you can see that, in like the press conference interviews for you from this year to last year, right? Yeah. I mean, obviously I watch, some of the press conferences, but you're there in person to be able to see how the guys are interacting. You were talking about the Bulls' recent struggles, so most recently, they've lost some games against some of the top teams in the league. They lost to the Grizzlies at home, which they did have a nice comeback in that game once it looked like they were, potentially going to be blown out. And then it looked like they might even be able to pull it off. I was at that game. It was a lot of fun, even though they lost. Then they had a pretty bad loss in Miami. And of course, last night against Atlanta, in which they kind of fell apart in the last couple of minutes. Despite the Bulls, and their otherwise good record. And again, this is one of the best seasons that the Bulls have had in a long time, which is why Bulls fans are so excited about this team. But despite all of that, the Bulls have not done that well against the best teams in the league, right? They've lost to the Heat 3 times, Sixers 3 times, swept by the Grizzlies, swept by the Warriors, lost to the Bucks. They got the Bucks tonight. They also lost to the Suns. Now, I know context should be given, right, for these games because they've had injuries. And I also use that kind of as a defense for this team for why they have a poor record against some of these teams. But do you think, should we be concerned with how the Bulls have shown out against these top teams in the league? Because for the most part, these games, it's not like they've lost in close games, right?
Yeah.
Most of them, they've gotten up beat pretty badly. Is that a sign that maybe this Bulls team just isn't at that level yet? And what do you think can be done?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly fair to be concerned about it. I think there's a middle ground as with anything. Like, I don't think you can fully excuse it as being a product of them being shorthanded. I also don't think you could call them complete frauds. I think there's always going to be something in the middle. I actually went in and looked at, the degree to which the Bulls have been shorthanded in a lot of these games. And I think it's fair to say they have been disproportionately affected. But at the same time, you're never going to make it through an entire NBA season at full health. A lot of the teams that they were playing in these games, like that second Warriors game, they didn't have Draymond Green or Klay Thompson. You go down the line on that. I mean, the Grizzlies didn't have Dylan Brooks. The Bucks have been without Lopez all season. There were 2 games against Philly at the beginning of the season when they were struggling with their own COVID issues. Didn't have Tobias Harris, Matisse Thybulle, Danny Green.
He didn't have Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo for one of the games.
Didn't have Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo on that second one. Bulls were COVID ravaged at that point. But so the point is, like, there's a middle ground to be had. But to me, the thing that concerns me is, one, as you mentioned, the margin of defeat against teams like Phoenix. It ends up being a 3-point loss. We all know that wasn't a 3-point loss. Right. When they pulled starters, they were down 15, and they were down by, I think, 27 or 28 in the third quarter of that game. The Grizzlies game, although they did have that last ditch comeback, I just don't take as seriously games where you're getting kicked around a little bit and then have that last ditch comeback. Now, the Grizzlies game is a little different because they really did have a chance to pull that one out with, a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
But to me, even if they had pulled that game out, I still wouldn't have left it feeling amazing because that's not a sustainable formula, right? Like falling behind by 15 or 20 points and then, having a last ditch comeback. The Bulls have had a couple of those this year, but it's not in a playoff atmosphere. I wouldn't count on winning games like that, often. So the margin of defeat, cleaning the glass, which is a site I love to use, for stats, they factor out garbage time, which I think is useful, especially talking about games like this. Has them as 4-15 against teams with top 10 point differentials. That's as of right now. And I think they're 28th in defense against those teams. So some of that has to do with, playing a lot of these teams when they've been without their 2 best defensive players in Caruso and Ball. But you still would like to see them steal a couple of these games, right? Like that would say a lot about the fortitude of this team. And it's not to say that they're, not mentally tough or anything like that. They've weathered a lot this season and they've been serious minded all season. And they've been one of the best clutch teams in the NBA all season. So it's not as if they're not capable. But to me, the defensive slippage since basically Christmas, which not so coincidentally is when Lonzo and Caruso start oscillating in the lineup. But the defensive slippage since then is undoubtedly concerning. The record against top teams is concerning. And to me, it adds all the more onus onto the stretch run of the season. They face so many of these premier teams, and you hope in the next 2 or 3 weeks they can get guys like Lonzo, Caruso, maybe even Patrick Williams, fingers crossed back. Like, you don't want the weight of the world to be on their shoulders when they come back. But if the Bulls don't sneak out a couple of these wins, Milwaukee and Philly coming up, those are 2 great opportunities. If they don't sneak a win or at least a close loss against those 2 teams coming up, it's going to put a lot of pressure on those guys coming back, which isn't ideal, but at the same time, it could be the reality of the situation.
Yeah. And it kind of leads me into my next question. You're talking about the Bucks and the Sixers coming up. So the Bulls have the Bucks tonight. They're going to be tested, right? Yet again, another conference heavy hitter. This is a pretty heavily anticipated game, not just because it's, 2 of the top teams in the East going head to head, not just because the Bulls are also going against Giannis, but it's the first time the Bulls will be playing the Bucks since that infamous flagrant foul from Grayson Allen on Alex Caruso, who has since been sidelined since that game, right? Do you think because of that, there's going to be a little extra motivation from the guys to really give it their all and play aggressively to get a revenge win tonight?
Oh, I think so for sure. I mean, look at Tristan Thompson's comments after the Hawks game. I mean,
I was going to ask you about.
First of all, actually, let me deflect this back to you because you have the fan perspective better than me. What do you think as a fan of a guy coming out and being so forceful and really not playing it safe with the with the comments on the Caruso Grayson Allen situation?
Yeah. So you're saying as far as like Grayson Allen, like what were my thoughts on the actual foul?
No, seeing Tristan Thompson come out and be so, so vociferous in his defense of Alex Caruso, even though he wasn't even on the team at the time.
Yeah,
that
was my initial. I was like, wow, he wasn't even on the team, but he's already ready to like stand up and defend the guys. I loved it. I loved actually the Tristan Thompson signing from the get-go. And I'd kind of been talking about that for a while on my channel, how I didn't really think the Bulls were going to potentially make any big trade deadline moves. I think we all wanted that to happen, and we were a little disappointed that it didn't happen. But Arturas was very clear in the sense that he said, we're pretty confident with our guys. We just need to be healthy. Where I did want them to actually, bulking up a bit was a bit more in that size department. And once Tristan Thompson got traded from the Kings to the Pacers, it was going to be made pretty clear that he was going to be, getting bought out. And so I love that signing. And I love that signing for that reason, because he is one of those guys that is going to stand up for his teammates. Based on his comments, I saw your tweet earlier this morning. I was going to ask you about that. He's pretty clear, like, yeah, we're not going to mess around. We're going to set the tone early. We're going to take this pretty seriously. You don't mess around with our guys. And I kind of like that mentality. I do think it's a bit aggressive. Casey actually tweeted something to this effect, and I completely agree. Yes, it's going to be a fun game. It's going to be a very, vengeful game. I'm sure the crowd is going to be pretty hostile, but you still need to make sure that you're getting the job done.
Exactly.
Stay focused and get a win. You need to win this game. It's a big test, and you need to show to the league that you're not one of these teams that's just going to keep losing to some of the top teams in the NBA. So yes, I like it, because I think everyone was pretty frustrated by what had happened, especially based on the Milwaukee Bucks reaction as a franchise to the actual flagrant foul. But we still need to be focused and making sure that we win the game. So that was sort of my perspective on it.
So here's where I land. One, agreed. The best vengeance is victory. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And even if this was a game of teams that were 5, places apart in the standings, it would be, tension packed from that perspective. Add in that the Bucks are only a game behind the Bulls, and a win here would take them one win closer to winning the season series. That's an all-important season series as the Bulls kind of try to stay in a home court position. There's a lot of like empirical, analytical reasons why this game is important. Now, the question of, do I think it's going to, raise their intensity and focus level? I would hope so, and I think so. The line to walk, though, is to not get so distracted by the sideshow that you're letting it, infect the game plan, the execution, and things like that. So, I thought it was, it's what you would expect from Tristan Thompson, because he's been an enforcer his entire career. Anybody who's watched him play, knows he's that. It's an NBA cliche, but he's a foxhole guy. He's a guy that you want to be in battles like that. DeMar DeRozan has called him a warrior. So that didn't surprise me at all. I actually think where it could possibly affect the Bulls if they walk this line correctly is, think about kind of what the company line has been after a lot of these losses where they've given up 120, 125, 130 points and lost these shootouts. Atlanta last night, perfect example. They were the first team in the NBA this season to shoot better than 59% from the floor in a game, the Bulls, and lose. That's a pretty amazing thing. Where I think it could help them is, as long as you don't get too wrapped up in it, if you're coming out and this is where I say the company line thing, the Bulls have been so adamant after a lot of these losses that they need to be more intense. They need to be more physical. They need to be more sharp from the get-go. And if that kind of sharpens their focus and their physicality from the opening tip, that could be a good thing in the sense of affecting the game's result. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I would not have expected that type of forceful response from this team sans Tristan Thompson, because it's such a cerebral group. It's such a, they're not a lot of these guys aren't overstated. They kind of let their actions do the talking. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there is an element of, especially without Caruso, having that energy, that, type of enforcer type in Tristan Thompson can be a boon. So we'll see how they're able to approach it. My hope, similar to KC sentiment and then the one that you just shared, I just hope we keep it in between the lines here. We've seen a lot of ugly stuff with fans, interjecting and interfering in games and things like that, booing, jeering, all that stuff is fair game. But I hope it kind of stays within the realm of, chippy play, maybe a hard foul if that's what needs to be done. And that things don't go too haywire here. Cause it is sports at the end of the day, even though what Grayson did, was reprehensible and resulted in a very serious injury. But but it should be interesting, especially when you see like Bobby Portis liking tweets of the Tristan Thompson quote, and then Bulls fans know what Bobby Portis is capable of from an enforcement perspective. And you mentioned the Bucks response, like how unprecedented to respond to that 1-game suspension, like with a statement decrying it. Like they're not going to back down. Yeah. So it all sets up for me. Like I think you can make a case it's the most important game of the Bulls season so far, empirically, and then from a setup narrative storyline standpoint, it's enormously intriguing from that perspective too. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. I mean, you're right in the sense that, you don't want to sink down to their level. You don't want to do the same type of thing where it's like, let's try to injure players, right? Like, that's just exactly. Not sportsmanlike conduct. And you don't want to, be that type of team, right? Because that's how the Bucks are now sort of being viewed after that type of play, based obviously on the response. I actually wasn't going to ask you this, but I'm curious. I asked Casey Johnson this question. I had him on just a few days after the incident. Yeah. I know that as writers, you guys have to be fair and objective in your reporting, but I'm curious to know, what was your impression of that play from Grayson Allen? I mean, you kind of talked about it. And the reason I ask is because there seems to be these two polarizing viewpoints in the matter, right? Where you have Bulls fans like myself who thought it was absolutely uncalled for, dirty play. Then the opposite end of the spectrum where you had the Bucks franchise come out with that statement, like you mentioned, after it was announced that they're going to be suspending Grayson Allen. They said they disagreed with the league's ruling, that they stood behind Allen. Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday also added they didn't think it was a dirty play, nor did they think Grayson Allen is a dirty player. What was your stance on the incident?
I thought it was a dirty play without a shadow of a doubt. And I haven't watched the replay in a while, but that second arm, right? The second yank where he rips him out of the air, that to me crosses the line. And when you look at his history, I mean, it's just like, it speaks for itself. There's a freaking 10-minute clip on YouTube or whatever. If you go look, I can't remember exactly how long it was, of dirty Grayson Allen plays. And I know there was something where, he actually hasn't been, ejected from an NBA game, or hasn't, like, come on. Like, we all know what this guy's reputation is. Yeah. So to me, it was unquestionably dirty in the moment, and it speaks to the Bulls, team reaction in the moment. I know people looking back are upset that, nobody, stood up to defend Caruso in that moment, but really in the moment, Caruso finishes that game and actually like impacted plays down the stretch, even though they don't end up winning. I think he hit a big three. He tied up Giannis for a loose ball with a freaking fractured wrist. I mean, the guy is just talk about warrior. And then after the game, the initial x-rays were negative. So the Bulls thought they had dodged a bullet. And the tone of Billy and Alex Caruso's comments after the game were, well, thank God nothing seriously happened. But, Billy went as far as to say, I think he could have ended his career. And Billy does not go so far as to single guys out in that forceful of nature often. So that to me said a lot. But unquestionably thought it was a dirty play. I didn't really know what to make of the 1-game suspension. Just with in terms of like the precedent for stuff like this, it seemed about in line. Yeah. But I know the league does take into account like injury severity in those types of decisions. So maybe for that, I would have expected a couple games longer. The Bucks statement I thought was very surprising. Mike Budenholzer and Bucks teammates stepping up for him, that didn't really surprise me much. And that honestly, that doesn't super offend me because that's your teammate. Like that's kind of, we talk about unwritten rules or whatever. Like that's, if you're a Milwaukee Buck, I mean, maybe you have the conversation behind closed doors of, come on, this is a little bit too far, but publicly you have to project support from him. You just have to. So I wasn't as offended by that part, but in terms of the play itself, completely dirty, uncalled for. I was pretty appalled. I remember watching it live. Then you have a couple hours where you think, well, thank God they dodged a major bullet. Next day, 6 to 8 weeks. And it's like,
Were you at that game in Milwaukee or?
No, KC was there. Looking back, I wish I had made the drive up, but no, I was watching on TV.
Okay. So the Grayson Allen drama aside, Ryan, the Bulls, like we mentioned, they still have a big game tonight. There's a chance to prove they can hang in, right, with these contending teams and try to change this narrative of, the Bulls are good, but they can't beat quality teams. What do you think the Bulls need to do tonight to be competitive in this game and come away with a win? Because the biggest challenge we've seen from this Bulls team, especially going against teams that have a lot of size, like the Bucks do. We now have Tristan Thompson, which we did in the last go around, but also we obviously don't have Alex Caruso. So what is your view? What are some of the keys to the game that we need to see from the Bulls tonight for them to get a win?
Offensive rebounds have killed them lately. Block out, especially a team with the Bucks size. Would not surprise me to see the Vucevic Thompson front court pairing, which we saw for the first time against Atlanta. Would not surprise me at all to see that again. I think they actually did a pretty good. I don't remember Giannis' stat line from the last game, but I remember watching, thinking they actually did a decent job, all things considered, defending him. try to replicate that effort as best you can. Would not surprise me to see Tyler Cook back from the G League. If I was coaching the team, I would, be calling his number. I don't know if they would start him again, but that'll be certainly something interesting to watch. So make life as difficult on Giannis as possible. And, last time they held the Bucks to 94 points, I think that was a little bit of a smokescreen because they missed a lot of open threes. But, defensively, they just have to be sharp in their rotations in closeouts because this Bucks team gets up a ton of threes when they're at their best. They can really rain hellfire on you and games can get out of hand in a hurry. But they've been inconsistent in their own right this season. So, I think sharper rotations, closeouts have been a struggle for the Bulls, especially without Caruso and Ball. So I would say those, it's no surprise. And every key to the game is going to be on the defensive end because offensively, the Bulls are firing at the level of a top 5 team as long as they're not turning the ball over. It's just a matter of holding the Bucks down enough so that, they can get this game to be within 1 or 2 possessions in the last 3 or 4 minutes. And then, you've got as good a closer as there is in the league right now, even though, he didn't come through against Atlanta. You're not going to shoot 100% in these clutch time scenarios. DeRozan, that is. But, Nate McMillan said this before the Hawks Bulls game last night, that good teams and great players remember losses like Atlanta had against the Bulls first game out of the All-Star break. He said Trae Young remembered that game. He proved it. I'm sure not only do the Bulls remember the last Bucks game because of the Caruso incident, I'm sure DeRozan, is not satisfied with his performance over the last few games. So if the Bulls can just keep it within a 1 to 2 possession game in those last 3 or 4 minutes, then it's kind of, up to the basketball gods at that point. And that's kind of all you could hope for.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it doesn't help that it's a back-to-back, right? Traveling back-to-back too. The guys are probably going to be
That's true.
A little tired. I'm actually curious whether or not we might even see Tristan Thompson in the starting lineup tonight.
I was going to say that. I would not surprise me at all, although Billy does not tip his hand with starters until, 15, 20 minutes before game time, but that would not surprise me at all either.
Yeah. And I had actually been talking about this on my channel for a little bit. Ever since, Thompson joined the team. I would love to see him play the 4, right? We saw that a little bit last night, that you actually saw Vucevic and Thompson playing together. And I think, when you're going against some of these bigger teams, especially teams who have big power forwards, example, Jaren Jackson Jr. Against the Grizzlies, John Collins, even though we didn't see him last night at the Hawks, but he's 6'10". Of course, Giannis tonight. I love Javonte Green. Don't get me wrong. He's one of my favorite players on this team, and he plays much bigger than his actual size. I think we all know that, but he's just no match against some of these guys who are 6'10", 6'11". I think in those instances, it doesn't make sense to have Vooch and Thompson out on the court together. So yeah, I would love to see what the rotations are going to look like, what the starting lineup is going to look like. I imagine they're probably going to be utilizing Thompson a bit more.
Let's just make sure Thompson doesn't get ejected in the first
I know.
quarter,
I was thinking, that was going to be my question around, your tweet from earlier this morning, which had that quote on Thompson. I was like, I just hope this guy doesn't, get thrown out of the game because he's fully ready for this one. So obviously the Bulls, recent struggles aside, some of that can sort of be attributed to the fact that, throughout this season, they just haven't been able to be fully healthy. Right now, obviously without Lonzo Ball, Alex Caruso, Patrick Williams, all of which are potentially slated to return this month, hopefully. What's the latest on their status? Have you seen them recently in the Advocate Center? How has their progress been coming along? And can we expect them to return to action this month?
So Lonzo and Caruso were working off those 6 to 8 week timelines, right? And both of them are in their 5th week, I believe, this week. The Bulls have not updated anything in relation to those, so I think we can still use them as a benchmark. Caruso has the cast off. He's got the brace off of the wrist. He's working on the court. Last time I was aware that he has not been cleared for contact yet, but the fact that he's doing work on the court certainly indicates that he's trending in that direction. Billy, the focus for Caruso is rebuilding strength in that wrist. He's talked a little bit about how when the first day he got the brace off, he could barely pass and shoot with his right hand. And that's the challenge of having something like this happen to your shooting hand. So Billy said probably a couple weeks of him building strength in that wrist, getting some on-court work in. So I think mid to late March is when I'm kind of eyeing for Caruso. I think that's optimistic, but something that Billy keeps repeating, that dude works as hard, if not harder than anybody. And from a conditioning perspective, I'm not sure that he's going to need as much of a ramp up as you would typically expect from a guy who's been sidelined for, 1 to 2 months, because he's going to be in just absolute tip top shape. So yeah, I think, it's hard because the Bulls aren't and they've done this with injuries for a lot of the season. They don't get over their skis. They don't put firm timelines on guys until they're absolutely sure that they're going to be in practice mode, cleared for contact. So I would be looking for him to be cleared to practice in the next 2 weeks, something like that. And then see what happens after that. That's speculative, but I think that's a pretty reasonable read of the tea leaves so far. Okay. Lonzo, I see as being on a similar timeline. It's a very different injury. He's been around the Advocate. He was actually traveling with the team. He was in Miami and Atlanta. He's been running a little bit more now, which is good to see. From my eye, he's ramped up his sprinting a little bit from the first time I saw him, which was right out of the All-Star break at the Advocate to now. Next step for him is doing some cutting, side to side running as opposed to just straight line ahead, changing directions and such. Billy also said for him, a couple weeks away, he's on a very similar 6 to 8 week timeline as Caruso. I think he's a couple days behind him. So again, 2 to 3 weeks, I'd keep an eye on him. Patrick Williams is a little bit more nebulous because his timeline from the beginning of the season when he had that surgery on his wrist was 6 to 8 months. We're right now smack in the middle of it. And I think the Bulls are being especially careful with him because he's a second-year player. He's 20 years old. Yeah. It was a very serious injury that he underwent, like tearing all those ligaments in his left wrist. It required a very complex surgery. So I think his rehab has taken a little bit different of a shape than a guy like a Caruso or a Ball. Patrick also has been, doing work with the basketball. I don't believe has been cleared for contact yet. I don't know. I really don't know how to read his rehab or recovery timeline in relation to those other guys. Because, as much as he's been rehabbing for the last 4 or 5 months, his injury was also, it seems, a little bit more severe and a little bit more intricate from a rehab perspective. So I can't even say, Caruso and Ball, I feel a little bit better saying, in the next 2 to 3 weeks, I think we'll have significant progress. If not, they'll be in the window of coming back. Pat, I don't really know, other than Billy has said he's optimistic he'll return before the end of the regular season, and the regular season ends in mid-April. So How much more time do you have other than, late March or something like that?
Do you think by the end of March, all three of them will be back?
I'm going to say Ball and Caruso, and I can't say confidently with Patrick just because it's been so shrouded in mystery. But I think 2 of the 3 feels like a safe bet as we sit here on March 4th. We'll see what happens. I should note also that the 6 to 8 week with Caruso is a reevaluation timeline. So they're going to have to re-image, rescan the wrist, make sure the bone's healing right. So, that's a little bit of a wrinkle in his too. But I think we're still 2 weeks away from being able to say definitively, okay, this guy's cleared for practice. This is when they're targeting for him to come back. Okay.
I'll get you out of here on this question. Assuming all of the players come back healthy in their respective timelines, and obviously even when they do come back, it's not like they're going to come back in tip top shape. It's probably going to take a little bit for them to kind of, get their wind under them. But, how do you see the Bulls finishing out the season? And what's sort of your projection from a playoff run perspective? And what do you think is realistic, or maybe even like, their highest ceiling?
Yeah, we gotta see what I think Ball and Caruso are the 2 biggest additions to get back and get reintegrated. So we'll see what they look like when they're back. I still think they finish in the top 4. I still think they finish in that 48 to 50 win window. They're at 39 right now with 19 to go. If you just stay 500 down the stretch, you're in that 48 to 50 win area code, which I think they'll need to be to stay top 4. The key is staving off Boston, who they have 1 game against at the very, very end of the season. That'll be very important because that'll decide the tiebreak. And Boston sneakily is only a game and a half behind them. And that's when you start to worry about home court advantage, which this Bulls team needs. I think they're 24-9 at home. They're a 500 team on the road. Yep. And it's their first playoff run as a unit. Even though there is a lot of deep playoff experience on this team, probably more than, obviously guys like Zach, Lonzo will be in their first playoff run. Vooch has only been outside of the first round once, and he was a role player with Philly when that happened. So I just think staying in that top 4 will be important for them. I expect them to. In terms of playoff success, it's hard for me to project past the second round at this point with how they've fared against Miami, Philly, and Milwaukee, because you're pretty confident you're going to run into one of those 3 teams in the second round. So they've still got something to prove against those teams to me before I can say that they're an Eastern Conference Finals team at this point. Getting guys back will help. But I still feel pretty good about them as a first round team. If they get a matchup like, one of the play-in teams, who knows what's going on with Brooklyn, but say it's Toronto or Atlanta, I'd obviously pick the Bulls in a series against those type of teams. I'd feel pretty confident, even with as well as Boston's been playing when the Bulls are whole. I'd feel pretty good about them in that matchup. I'd feel pretty good about them in a Cleveland matchup. Once you get into that elite tier, it gets a little bit more difficult. So to put the Tybo on that, I'd say 48 to 50 win range, top 4 seed, second round, would be my prediction. And then, let's see when these guys come back, if we can get that ceiling back to what it looked like it could have been at the beginning of the season.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even think you can't really rule out the Nets either now with Kevin Durant being back.
No, you can't.
Potentially Ben Simmons, coming back. We don't really know how he's going to look, but before he basically took this whole season off, he was still an all-star level player. Say what you want about his shooting, but that's also not a team that you probably want to face in the first round. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's going to be a lot of challenges going into the playoffs, going up against some of these elite teams. But a lot can change based on how healthy this team can be. We've seen this team be drastically different when it comes to their defense, when you're talking about Caruso and Lonzo being on the court. So I'm excited. I just can't wait for these guys to come back. It's always hard as a fan, when injuries are just always plaguing you.
It's got to be fatiguing. And it happens to every team. But if you're a Bulls fan, you just got to feel battered by it. Just feels like there's this stretch of every season where the injuries take hold and it's kind of this dreary, February to March stretch. The difference this time is, and some perspective, all these early regular season wins that they banked are benefiting them now. The fact that they're even still in a position of leverage at all. They just have to really take advantage of some of their opportunities over the next few weeks.
Yeah. And the good thing is they still have their best players, right? I know Zach Lavine isn't necessarily 100%, right? He's talked about that, but you still have DeMar DeRozan. You still got Vucevic, even, despite his struggles. And that's a good thing, right? It's not like the Derrick Rose years where your best player, you knew that you weren't going to make a deep playoff run without him. So, but anyway, Rob, I'll get you out of here, man. I know you got to head to the United Center here in a few hours and you got a busy day covering the game. As always, man, really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with everyday fans like myself. I know my audience greatly appreciates it as well. Keep up the great work and let's stay in touch.
Hey, absolutely. Always love coming on. And I hope viewers appreciate, I changed up my background a little bit this time. I was, last time I had my little pipe in my 700 square foot apartment. I saw a comment that I looked like I was in my mom's basement. I promise it's not glamorous out here, the life of a Chicago Bulls beat writer, but we're on the third floor in my own rented apartment, and I changed it to that's my bedroom door and a plain white wall behind.
I like it. I actually remember that comment now, and I was like, this is Rob Schafer, man. The guy works at NBC Sports Chicago. Have a little respect, but anyway, all right. Again, be sure to follow Rob on Twitter. Check out the Bulls Talk podcast if you haven't already. Don't forget to tune into the Bulls game tonight. Until then, be sure to subscribe also to this channel. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Rob, thanks again, man. Appreciate it.
Yep, no worries.